Hello everyone, this is Ancha Arora, founder of ShodhEco, which is a research initiative started in order to disseminate information about economics, public policy and geopolitics. Welcome to our podcast series where we bring experts on the dais and engage in informative dialogue with them. Today we have with us Dr. Pradeep Apte, who is a distinguished professional at Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics and a professor at Fergusson College. He has made extensive contributions at state, center, and global economic forums in the areas of international economics and public finance. He has authored several books and has many research publications under his name. Today he will be talking about the history of economic institutions in India. Sir, can you tell us about the academic and research institutions which have played a vital role in building economics as a discipline in India?
Well, there are many centers in which the economic thinking, particularly economic thinking of the modern type, which started emerging as a response to the nature of British rule that was prevalent. Quite paradoxically it may sound, but the fact is that the Britishers started campaigning and also establishing various institutions which was of the type which was prevalent in Europe. And the kind of education and educational institutions that prevailed in those times in India indigenously were of slightly different nature. But having exposed to that kind of an educational milieu, educational institutions, practices, there were several scholars which emerged from the institutions established, promoted by British government itself, which in fact became a kind of a first flame and a first major Renaissance-like movement in India. And as a one part of that Renaissance in thought, which was partly also rooted in tradition, but also much more open in terms of receiving and recepting new kinds of ideas that were coming from, by and large, European continent then. That were also an equally important kind of a twist or a change that occurred in the tradition. There were certain centers which were more prominent, by and large because of the nature of urbanization that was already prevalent, and also because in these urban setup, for variety of other political as well as economic reasons, the Britishers had established their own capital, even as a part of a company government. So it dates back way back to 1818 onward. For example, if you consider the Western Maharashtra, Pune became one of the center. So did the Bombay, and many schools and many colleges that were established. In fact, good credit of that goes to one governor of Bombay province then, that is Elphinstone, who was instrumental in promoting these ideas. And it was not only universities and colleges, but also reform kind of a traditional education that was imparted in India. That also got into the form of schools rather than the mere pathshalas. And the nature of branches of education that were prevalent, for example, take for example Grant Medical College that was established in Mumbai. Many such institutions started springing up. Two major institutions which were relevant was, of course, one Elphinstone College, and much earlier than that was the New Pune College, later named as Deccan College in Pune. And that's how we now recognize it as a still functioning institution of those old times. Many leaders of the independence movement, particularly in the Western India, were actually products of these institutions. And because of the nature of economic repression, drain, as well as stagnation that we were experiencing, many of them started taking to the very same theories which were being propounded and talked about in Britain or in Europe in those times, and they started providing some kind of a new, fresh infusion of thought on economic grounds. For example, Mahadev Govinda Ranade, way back in 1843, gave 4 lectures on trade, that is, cross-border trade, what we now usually call international trade, and the consequences of that, and also the nature of options that would be available for the countries which are not that developed, which are not that industrialized, and for those countries, what should be the best optimal policy of trade was being propounded. It had the traces of influences of, for example, Frederick List's argument of stages of growth, and they were published and they have been in fact reprinted by Gokhale Institute of Economics and Politics and Economics later. So that was probably one of the most important document which reflects the nature of thought process of the early leaders of Indian Renaissance, also of course the leaders of the movement for Indian political independence. So that's how it started, and many institutions sprang up following the similar kind of a model, but inspired more by a nationalistic emphasis and a thought. For example, Deccan College was promoted by the British government itself to convert it into what was called the Dakshina Fund, that was seized after the Peshwai was taken over by British rule. But later, the very students of Deccan College came together and thought of establishing their own college, their own schools, and that's how the Fergusson College was born. And that is still functioning now. It's almost 125-30 years. Their schools are much longer than that. And these people had a very different kind of a blend, because they were rooted in Indian tradition. They also had a traditional kind of a training. They knew the value of Pathshala kind of education, but they also knew the limitations of that education. And they knew that the industrialization was knocking at the doors of India, and it was bound to flourish, and they were pretty aware of that. And for this new kind of social milieu, new kind of an economic circumstances, a different kind of education was needed. So they started all kinds of, very few people are in fact aware that Fergusson College also had something like what was called community college in Europe. And what is now in fact the Jagannath Rathi Vocational Guidance and Vocational Training Center, that was in those days called the Community College of Fergusson College. Okay. The whole purpose was to in fact impart education in such kinds of crafts, skills, which would be relevant for the new kind of an era, and that still survives. So the idea of community college was also floated around the same time, apart from what we usually call the formal degree-based or degree-oriented education. As a part of that, economics as a discipline also obviously emerged, and for example, Fergusson College had established an independent department teaching economics, teaching economic history, and also teaching economic thought in the modern as well as in ancient times. And one of the person who was instrumental in this was V.G. Kade. And he in fact was also a member of Tariff Commission then in 1916. And later, of course, in the very same tradition, as I have told you, 1844, Ranade gave the lecture on international trade policy. Many independence leaders also wrote extensively on economic matters. For example, Lokmanya Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote it. Also Agarkar wrote around it. In fact, in 1855, Krishna Shastri Chipurnkar, father of Vishnu Shastri Chipurnkar, had in fact translated some of the books which were originally in English, mostly modeled after John Stuart Mill or very palpable influences of Adam Smith and Ricardo's writing. So there was a book which was translated way back in 1843, which was called Lakshmi Vidya, which was dealing with the science of economics. Later, John Stuart Mill, together with Marset, Mrs. Marset, had published a kind of a small volume meant for a popular consumption on political economy, which was in fact title of his as well as Ricardo's own book on this, or treatise on this. And that was also translated way back in 1856. Okay. So there were several such kinds of pamphlets and the books that were dealing with kind of a modern economic thought that were translated in vernacular languages around the same time. What I am giving you are the instances of what happened in this region, that is, and that's why they were translated in Marathi. A similar kind of a thing happened in Bengal. Similar kind of a thing happened in Tamil language, in Kannada language, and so on. So that was probably the first steps of the India's brush with the modern economic thinking and modern economic thought, as well as modern kind of a economic policy related arguments. Later, that took further turn and became independent institution, probably more or less devoted to these kinds of specialized subjects like commerce and economics, as it was called. ShodhEco College, for example, in Mumbai was one such institution which was also very specialized in this. So was the Fergusson. So was the so-called Brihad Maharashtra Commerce College established in Pune as a sort of walking in the footsteps of ShodhEco Commerce College. And more importantly, in Pune, there was an institution floated by Servants of India Society, which was established by Gokhale, G.K. Gokhale, one of the very prominent, though the moderate leaders of Congress. He was very keen observer and writer and commentator on economic affairs. So in his memory, because he write pretty at an early age, so in his memory, a separate institution was floated by Servants of India Society, which is now known as Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. And the person who was given the whole task of establishing this institution was D.R. Gadgil, Dhananjay Ramchandra Gadgil, who was himself trained in Cambridge. His specialization was economic history. And he came back to India, became the principal of Surat College, and then Servants of India Society invited him to become the founder of this newly proposed envisaged institution, which is now known as, famous as Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. So it was D.R. Gadgil's vision, D.R. Gadgil's ideas that he had learnt not only in Cambridge, but also of his own very intimate touch with the nature of economic life that he had been seeing, watching, conversant with in many cities in India, Mumbai, Surat, Pune. And he started inquiring, and he realized that the major deficiency that one has to face is we didn't have a tradition of the kind of economic history that was available in those times. And he in fact started his effort on two ways. Firstly, there was a Bharat Itihas Sanshodhak Mandal that was established almost 25 years back. Before that, due to the leadership of V.K. Rajwade. They had started looking into the nature of economic transaction in Peshwai's time. Almost 100 years, nearly 100 years later, the demise of or the fall of the Peshwai regime. But the kind of economic system prevailed in those times. For example, the kind of commerce that was conducted, the kind of money lending that was conducted, the practices which each of these professions have had, and the newly emerging technologies as well as newly emerging kind of economic activity. For example, it was in those times the traditional kind of, for example, textile industry was getting modernized. Britishers had started investing, British companies had invested in modern textile. So all these, including another major industry, was printing. So consequences of emergence of these kinds of new technologies and trades and professions was being studied with a different kind of an eye in terms of collecting the relevant data and information needed, both on historical as well as on present current basis. And that was the vision of Gadgil, who thought that this kind of a collection of data, systematic information available to document and monitor the way in which economy is growing, is relevant. He also undertook very interesting studies. For example, in those times, the automobile industry had only emerged in a very nascent manner in India. And automobiles being used in transport of variety of materials. That was one of the independent study published by Gokhale Institute. It says the nature of motor transport, motorized transport in and around Pune and Mumbai. Similarly, he studied way in which auctions of several agricultural commodities happened in major marketplaces. He also studied cost of cultivation. How much does it cost to produce certain kind of a crop? By collecting data right from the farm level. The initial surveys were made in the Y region, which is near Mahabaleshwar, because Mahabaleshwar is more known than Y is now. But some of the villages, most notably one of the village, Gulum, where very large extensive survey of cost of cultivation was documented. it was these kinds of studies which in a way paved path for later establishing the kind of data collection system that was felt necessary by several scholars. Of course, Gadgil is one of the example on this side. There are several thinkers of this similar type. For example, V.K.R.V. Rao, who was in those times studying in Oxford, and in fact he made an effort from whatever fragmentary data that were available in those times. He tried to establish something like what we now call as national income of India. Another similar kind of an effort made was by Mahalanobis, who had established the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. And he was also involved in similar kind of large scale surveys, and that was one of the very pioneering aspect, not only for India but for world over, that conducting large scale economic surveys for the purposes of collecting information on variety of aspects of social functioning, most notably in economic functioning, was one of the major breakthrough that was in a way signal to the world. And India in fact became one of the most prominent leaders in this field, or rather one branch of statistics, that is large scale economic surveys. And when Mahalanobis started this in ISI, one of his students was in fact picked up specifically for the very same kind of a task by D.R. Gadgil in Pune. So he from Calcutta he came back to Pune and was one of the major leading experts, who was later to become the National Sample Survey Organization chairman in its reorganized form when it was shifted from the ISI Calcutta, was in fact direct student of Mahalanobis, that is V.M. Dandekar. So when a committee was constituted in 1950s to estimate what the national income of India is, the three people who joined that committee were precisely these three people involved in this: V.K.R.V. Rao, Prashant Chandra Mahalanobis and D.R. Gadgil. So these were the three most important luminaries, so to say, of economic thinking and policy making in India, because one major question in that time was the nature of data availability on understanding functioning of the economy was very thin and very meager, because mostly it was developed on the departmental basis. To the extent British government thought it necessary, it was collected, otherwise it was mostly absent. So these were the three people who in a way produced variety of development of both institutionally as well as technology wise and technique wise, and they started establishing the kind of nature of economic policy questions, how they are to be posed, how they are to be addressed, and to address them what sort of data that would be needed for this purpose. At all these three levels, the economic researches got focused, apart from the usual conceptual ways in which the economic science was being usually talked about or even taught about.
Okay. So the second question is, we all have heard about the brain drain theory of Dadabhai Naoroji. Can you elaborate upon contributions of Indian economists, especially in the 19th and the 20th century?
In fact, the very same people which I referred to, for example, if you look at Tilak or Agarkar, whose editorials used to reflect on this thought, there were many policy occasions on which there was a great furor raised by them. For example, Gokhale talked about it in the assembly. Like for example, in those times, what prevailed was the kind of a fixed exchange rate linked with some so-called precious metal, for example, silver standard, a gold standard. And the consequences of the rate of exchange between sterling pound and rupee being defined in a manner which was again had a basis of silver or gold standard, or the fusion of that or the blend of that, had consequences on the way in which our imports or export so-called competitive advantage was either being affected directly by it. So many have actually commented on that. So there are many such facets, ranging from taxation, the nature of restrictions that Britishers imposed on the growth of industries, growth of various kinds of trades and professions. So that had undergone a change, and the economic consequences were felt, and people did talk about it. In a way, economic drain theory was a more articulate argument, a political argument, that if the British power is removed, very large number of the present distortions to economic potential and its realizations would be removed with the political change. That is the primary thesis or the primary argument of that economic drain theory. How much drain did it actually cause or may have caused is a very complex question, because there are many facets of that kind of a consequence of the British rule or the British policies that might have inflicted on Indian economy, whose estimations would not be really very credibly made for the lack of relevant data. If one goes by official accounts alone, then probably the estimates would look too small. If one considers variety of myriad of such consequences, the drain would appear very large. But these key aspects of economic functioning in the modern system, affected by the nature of restrictions imposed by British from time to time, most of the times as suited to the British trading as well as the industrial interest, that did in fact distort. Of course, the situation started gradually changing from 1919 onwards, and the nature of relationship between industry and the government also started changing, but that was mostly after the First World War. I think there is one book by Rajat K. Rai which examines this rather complicated and strenuous kind of a relationship between government and the business after the, I think that name is Industrialization in India or something like that. It's a very revealing kind of a book on industrialization of India. Or if you look, read even the later, for example, Tirthankar Rai has extensively written on this, particularly the way in which British rule affected Indian economy from say 1857 to 1947. I think Tirthankar Rai's book gives a excellent summary of this.